7 weapons God has given you, and your enemies hope you will never use them. Have you ever woken up, done nothing yet, and still felt like you had already lost a battle? Not because you were not trying hard enough, but because you were holding the wrong weapons against the shadows inside your own mind. A locked door is not the only thing that keeps a person trapped. Sometimes it is exhaustion. Sometimes it is shame. Sometimes it is the quiet belief that you are weaker than the darkness pressing against your life. There are people who wake up every morning already defeated before the day even begins. Not because God abandoned them, but because they keep reaching for the wrong weapons. They argue with fear using panic. They answer temptation with willpower alone. They fight spiritual exhaustion by staying busy until their soul goes numb. Meanwhile, Scripture keeps describing believers as people who were never sent defenseless into the world. Ephesians 6:11 says, "Put on the whole armor of God, that ye may be able to stand against the wiles of the devil." Not pieces of it, the whole armor, which means heaven already anticipated the battle long before you felt it. I have noticed something painful in my own life. The enemy rarely needs to destroy a person completely. Sometimes he only needs to convince them to leave their weapons untouched, to let prayer collect dust, to let truth stay closed inside a Bible resting on a wooden table, to let fear speak louder than obedience, and slowly a strong soul begins living like a defenseless one. But Scripture paints a different picture. Again and again, God places weapons into ordinary hands. Shepherds, prisoners, prophets, fishermen, tired people, frightened people, people who shook while obeying. This is not about becoming louder, it is about becoming awake. Because there are weapons heaven already placed in your hands, and your enemies hope you never realize what they can actually do. Number 1, the weapon of stillness. We usually think battle means making more noise, but sometimes the strongest move you can make is closing the door and refusing to feed the chaos. The world rewards constant reaction. Notifications flash. Opinions collide. Fear spreads faster than wisdom. Many people have not sat in silence with God for years because silence feels unproductive. But Scripture keeps revealing something strange. God often speaks after the noise breaks apart. In 1 Kings 19, Elijah expected God in the wind, the earthquake, and the fire. But the voice came in a still small whisper. That detail matters more than most people realize. The enemy loves internal chaos because confusion weakens discernment. A person who cannot slow down eventually loses the ability to recognize what is driving them. Anxiety starts sounding like urgency. Exhaustion starts sounding like sacrifice. Fear starts sounding like wisdom. I remember sitting in my car once after an exhausting week, gripping the steering wheel while rain tapped softly against the windshield. I kept asking God for direction, but my mind sounded like a crowded room. Every thought fought for attention. Every fear demanded a decision immediately. Nothing became clear until I stopped trying to force clarity. Stillness is not passivity, it is resistance. Psalm 4:6-10 says, "Be still, and know that I am God." The verse is not merely comforting, it is confrontational. It asks the soul to release control long enough to remember who is actually sovereign. The enemy hopes you will stay mentally flooded all the time because hurried people rarely listen deeply. They react, they scroll, they escape. But stillness creates space for conviction, wisdom, and correction. And many battles are lost simply because people never become quiet enough to recognize what they are truly fighting. But stillness is only the first weapon. Once the noise drops, something deeper comes into view. Number 2, the weapon of truth. A lie repeated long enough can begin to feel like memory. And that is exactly why lies can become strangely comfortable. Truth is dangerous to darkness not because it sounds inspiring, but because it tears apart the false rooms we build inside the mind. Those rooms can feel safer than reality. Inside them, disappointment becomes familiar, fear becomes predictable, failure becomes a kind of shelter. We start believing the lie that at least in that narrow space, we do not have to face the terror of change. Sometimes we would rather live in a room of familiar hopelessness than step into the light, because the light does not let us control what happens next. We cling to pain not because we love it, but because it is known. We know where the corners are, we know how the darkness sounds, we know how to survive inside it. And that strange familiarity can feel like safety, even when it is only a polished prison. When Jesus was tempted in the wilderness, he did not argue emotionally with Satan. He answered with Scripture, "It is written," again and again. There is something deeply humbling about that moment. The Son of God responded to spiritual attack with the written word, while many believers now try to survive entirely on feelings. Feelings matter, but feelings are unstable guides when fear is steering them. The enemy studies distortion carefully. He whispers things that sound almost true. You will never change. God is disappointed in you. You are too far gone. No one sees your pain. You must control everything or your life will collapse. And if those lies remain unchallenged, they slowly build rooms inside the mind. Not just walls of deception, but furnished rooms, comfortable ones. Rooms where disappointment feels safer than obedience because disappointment is known, measured, and familiar. Change is not. Truth demands a door. It demands light. It asks you to step out of the place where hopelessness has become your routine. I have done this before. I have replayed false narratives so often that they started sounding familiar, even comforting. There is a strange safety in hopelessness because hopeless people stop expecting transformation. But John 8:32 says, "And ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free." Freedom usually begins with exposure. A dusty Bible left unopened beside the bed may look harmless, but neglected truth leaves the mind vulnerable to voices that never deserved authority in the first place. The enemy hopes Scripture becomes decorative in your life instead of alive. Because once truth begins cutting through deception, chains weaken faster than people expect. And once truth becomes clear, you cannot stay in the room forever. You have to move. But truth alone does not change a life that keeps delaying action. For that, you need the next weapon. Number 3, the weapon of obedience. Most people want clarity before obedience. God often asks for obedience before clarity. That tension frustrates nearly everyone at some point. The Israelites stood at the edge of the Jordan River carrying the ark, while floodwaters rushed violently in front of them. According to Joshua 3, the river did not part before they moved. It opened after their feet touched the water. That is uncomfortable theology for fearful people. Because obedience frequently feels risky at first. It asks you to forgive while still hurting, to apologize while pride burns in your throat, to leave environments that are slowly poisoning your soul, to stop entertaining compromises that everyone else calls normal. The enemy understands something many people ignore. Delayed obedience slowly reshapes the heart. Every day you postpone obedience, the voice of truth grows softer until it becomes a distant echo you can easily ignore. The longer a person resists conviction, the quieter conviction becomes. I once knew I needed to make a difficult decision that would disappoint people around me. I delayed it for months. Outwardly, I looked calm. Internally, I felt split in half. Every day of avoidance increased the weight, because disobedience rarely creates peace. It creates fragmentation. James 1:22 says, "But be ye doers of the word, and not hearers only, deceiving your own selves." That last phrase is unsettling. Deceiving your own selves. Not every deception enters from outside. Some forms grow slowly through repeated compromise. through explaining away conviction, through calling spiritual numbness maturity. The enemy hopes you keep studying obedience instead of practicing it, because heaven's power often moves through action, not merely agreement. And sometimes the smallest act of obedience becomes the doorway that changes the direction of an entire life. Sometimes it is not dramatic. Sometimes it is a short text that says, "I am sorry," even while your heart is still sore. No applause, no spotlight, just the painful decision to move while you are still hurting. A short apology can carry the weight of a Jordan crossing. One message, one trembling hand, one small step into deep water. And yet heaven can meet that step with a miracle no one else sees. That is often where freedom begins. But once obedience starts moving, prayer becomes the breath that keeps the soul from folding back into fear. Number 4, the weapon of prayer. There are prayers whispered so quietly that nobody else hears them. Heaven still does. Prayer is often misunderstood because people treat it like emergency language instead of relational language. Many only pray intensely when something collapses. But Scripture presents prayer as daily dependence, not occasional desperation. Daniel prayed even when it became dangerous. Jesus prayed in lonely places before crowds ever saw the miracles. Paul prayed inside prison walls while chains hung from his body. Prayer keeps appearing beside impossible situations because prayer shifts alignment before it shifts circumstances. The enemy hates prayer that is honest, not polished prayer, honest prayer. The kind spoken with trembling hands resting on a kitchen counter at midnight. The kind prayed while sitting on the floor after another disappointing day. The kind that says, "Lord, I do not even know what to ask anymore." Romans 8:26 says, "The Spirit itself maketh intercession for us with groanings which cannot be uttered." That verse carries mercy inside it. Because some seasons leave people too exhausted to form elegant faith. Sometimes all they have left is a sigh, a whisper, silence mixed with tears. And that sigh is not empty. It is a language. It is the battle cry of a soul that has fallen to the floor but is still facing the light. It tells darkness, "I am not gone. I am not agreeing with this. I am still turning toward God, even now." I think many believers secretly believe prayer only matters if it sounds powerful. But some of the deepest prayers in Scripture came from broken people standing in unbearable tension. The enemy hopes shame will keep you from praying honestly. He hopes disappointment will convince you to stay distant from God, because isolated souls become easier to influence. But prayer reconnects the heart before the darkness fully hardens it. Even a groan can become a weapon. A sigh is not nothing. When words fail, presence still speaks. Sitting there in pain, not performing, not hiding, not running, is already a refusal to let distance win. And after prayer, gratitude becomes the next way the heart learns to stay open. Number 5, the weapon of gratitude. Complaining changes the atmosphere inside a person long before it changes their words. Israel witnessed miracles in the wilderness and still became consumed by bitterness. Water came from rocks, bread fell from heaven. Yet dissatisfaction kept spreading through the camp like smoke. That pattern still exists. Modern exhaustion often trains people to notice absence more than presence. The unanswered prayer becomes larger than daily mercy. The closed door becomes louder than the breath still filling their lungs every morning. Gratitude interrupts that distortion, not fake positivity, not pretending pain does not exist. Real gratitude notices God without denying hardship. Gratitude is not pretending the dark room is bright. It is learning to see grace even while the room stays dark. It is a skill of observation in the shadows, the ability to notice mercy before the darkness fully lifts. It is learning to recognize that grace is still present even when the door you long for remains shut. And when everything is coming apart, that gratitude becomes defiance. You are not pretending the fire is not hot. You are standing in it and refusing to let fear tell you what grace is allowed to look like. You are saying to terror, "You may take comfort, but you will not govern how I see the kindness of God." I once sat at a small table early in the morning while sunlight slowly moved across the floorboards. Nothing dramatic had changed in my life. The problems were still there. But for a few moments, I stopped measuring my life only by what was missing. That shift mattered more than I expected. 1 Thessalonians 5:18 says, "In everything give thanks, not for everything." In everything, there is a difference. The enemy wants discouragement to become your permanent lens because discouraged people stop noticing grace. They become spiritually numb, cynical, heavy, and eventually they stop expecting God to move at all. But gratitude reopens the eyes. Sometimes the weapon is not dramatic warfare. Sometimes it is remembering the prayers God already answered, remembering the mercy that carried you before, remembering that despair does not deserve full control over your vision. And gratitude is not the end of the battle, because isolation will still try to pull you back into silence. Number 6, the weapon of community. Isolation changes people quietly. At first, it feels safer, simpler, less disappointing. No vulnerability, no correction, no risk, just distance. But Scripture never describes believers surviving alone for very long. Even Jesus surrounded himself with disciples. The early church prayed together, suffered together, wept together, and carried one another through persecution. In older battles, a single shield could not stop a rain of arrows by itself. Soldiers had to stand shoulder to shoulder and lock their shields into one wall. That is what community is. Not just company. A shield wall. A place where someone else's faith covers the crack in yours when your arms are too tired to lift. Yet many people slowly disappear emotionally while still attending church physically. They smile during conversations while hiding unbearable exhaustion underneath. I have done this before, nodding while feeling detached from everyone in the room, acting strong because admitting weakness felt dangerous. But hidden wounds deepen in isolation. Galatians 6:2 says, "Bear ye one another's burdens." Not observe them, not analyze them from a distance. Bear them. The enemy loves isolation because isolated thoughts grow louder without interruption. Fear expands, shame multiplies, temptation becomes easier to justify in secret, and pride often disguises itself as independence. There is a reason predators separate prey from the group first. Community is not weakness, it is protection. Not every person deserves access to your deepest struggles. Wisdom still matters, boundaries still matter. But trusted spiritual companionship keeps darkness from becoming the only voice speaking into your life. When you are too weak to lift your own shield, the person beside you can raise theirs and cover the gap. Sometimes healing begins with a conversation people delayed for far too long. And once you are no longer fighting alone, you begin to understand that some battles last longer than your patience. Number 7, the weapon of persistent faith. Some battles last longer than expected. That reality unsettles people because many secretly believe strong faith should produce immediate relief. But Scripture repeatedly shows faithful people walking through long seasons of waiting. Noah built for years before rain appeared. Joseph sat in prison before elevation came. The woman with the issue of blood suffered 12 years before touching Jesus' garment. Persistent faith is not loud confidence every day. Sometimes it looks like continuing to pray after disappointment, continuing to worship while confused, continuing to obey while nothing feels resolved yet. Sometimes it even looks like standing in the silence with your anger, your confusion, and your questions still intact and refusing to leave anyway. Because you know the darkness does not get the final word. Hebrews 10:36 says, "For ye have need of patience, that, after ye have done the will of God, ye might receive the promise." Patience sounds beautiful in sermons. It feels heavier in real life, especially when answers delay, especially when silence stretches longer than expected, especially when exhaustion whispers, "Stop trying." I remember seasons where faith felt less like soaring and more like crawling forward, inch by inch. Some nights the only victory was refusing to completely give up. And honestly, that mattered. The enemy hopes delay will convince you abandonment has occurred. He hopes waiting will slowly drain trust from your heart until cynicism replaces expectation. But many spiritual victories happen quietly, long before circumstances visibly change. A seed underground still grows in darkness before anyone sees green above the soil. Conclusion: the weapons still rest in your hands. There is a difference between owning a weapon and using it. Many believers already possess everything God has given them, yet live as though darkness has final authority. The Bible stays closed. Prayer becomes occasional. Truth becomes blurred by emotion. Community stays distant. Obedience gets postponed until fear loosens its grip. And slowly, the soul forgets what strength feels like. But tonight, before you move on to another distraction, another video, another layer of noise, pause for a moment. Let the silence settle. Look honestly at the condition of your inner life, the way someone examines a lamp before nightfall. Which weapon have you stopped using? Pause. Maybe the answer is stillness, maybe truth, maybe prayer, maybe the painful act of obedience you have delayed for months. The enemy was never hoping you would become perfect. He was hoping you would become passive. Do not hand over your peace that easily. Open the Bible again. Pray honestly again. Reach for people who strengthen your soul. Stand back up even if your knees still shake. Tonight, before you scroll past one more video to escape the silence, stop. The enemy is not afraid of how busy you are. He is afraid of the moment you realize there is still a weapon in your hand. Blow the dust off it. Lift it. A weapon covered in dust can still be lifted. But it only helps if you raise it. Write this in the comments: I will not leave these weapons untouched.